5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. It's Lichtman Live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
It's a sad day for America, and a particularly sad day for older people like myself. I'm not saying it's me, but a lot of older people are dependent upon the stock market for their retirement. And given Trump's utterly ill-advised tariffs, according to some reports, Sam, get this, $2.5 trillion in wealth was lost overnight. Stock market, the Dow crashed by 1,600 plus points. Older people are watching their savings, their 401k retirement funds plummeting. At the same time, they're also making it more difficult to collect your Social Security, indeed threatening Social Security overall, what Elon Musk has called the Ponzi scheme.
It's not just bad for old people. I mean,
well, I feel the old people, you know.
This is young people have to live in this country for a long time. And
That's
it seems
right.
Like maybe our future is in peril economically. Who knows? Obviously, Trump and his administration are claiming that this is going to bring back manufacturing and bring back jobs and end unfair trade agreements. What do you think, Dad?
That's all a pile of nonsense.
Really?
Why are we suffering trade deficits? First of all, they're not that devastating. It's a good reason. Are we going to pay people $5 an hour, $2 an hour to work?
We shouldn't, no.
We're not going to, and we shouldn't. So, yes, goods are produced much more cheaply abroad, and that keeps down the prices of things like our computer here, the cell phone that's sitting over here, television, and so much else that we buy. Economists estimate that the tariffs are going to cost the average family $2,100 a year in higher prices.
So you're not buying this at anything that's coming from the Trump administration, that this is just going to be a temporary down dip, and then America is going to bounce back with more jobs.
When has the Trump administration told you the truth about anything?
That's fair.
Yeah. Look, and, J.D. Vance said that today. Oh, it's just a blip. It's a transition. That's not the way the stock market works. The stock market works on future expectations. If, in fact, investors believed that this was just a temporary blip and that, in fact, the future was very bright for the American economy and American business, you would not see the stock market bleeding $2.5 trillion in wealth. And by the way, this was not a singular event. Market's been crashing for weeks because it in advance, it discounted the Trump tariffs. Well, it turns out they were worse than expected. So even with the market already crashing, discounting the anticipated tariffs, you still got, Bloody Thursday, I would call it. Black Thursday, one of the worst days in the history of the market. And as you say, not only bad for us old people who depend on our retirement funds, but it really does put in jeopardy, young people's future. How bright does our future get when we're looking at this kind of trade war?
But what about people who rightly say that America has, over time lost its main streets, lost thousands and thousands of jobs, has been in a lot of unfair trade agreements? What would you say to that?
America, to listen to Donald Trump, you would think Joe Biden presided over something worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. In fact, job growth under Biden, when we were all getting ripped off and things were so terrible, was a near record. Even looking at the Trump record before the pandemic, if you look at year by year job growth, Joe Biden exceeded it. Unemployment was about 4%, an historic low. We were the economic envy of the world. So all of that, is a self-serving fabrication, a fairy tale. Now, when I first heard Donald Trump talk about, right, Sam, making America great again, I thought he was talking about, maybe the 1950s or perhaps more likely the 1980s, when you had Ronald Reagan as president. Well, we learned yesterday he wasn't talking about the 1980s. He was talking about the 1880s, right?
Right. He said it explicitly in his speech. When he was speaking yesterday on his tariff announcement, he said he wants to bring back wealth in America like in the 1880s and early 1900s, which is the robber baron era?
That is the robber baron era, the notorious Gilded Age, one of the worst periods in American history. Yes, a lot of wealth was created, but where did that wealth go, Sam?
To a very small amount of people.
That's why they called it the era of the robber barons. There wasn't just one Elon Musk in those days. There were quite a number of robber barons who, based on today's dollars, were about as rich as Elon Musk. Andrew Carnegie, for example. Historians estimate that in today's dollars, his net worth was $309 billion. But even he wasn't the richest. You know who the richest magnate was of that time? It's a very famous name. You know the name. The family has been rich. And
Rockefeller?
The Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller, you know what he was worth estimated?
400.
400 billion. And that's just a couple of examples. The wealth was never shared by ordinary Americans, many of whom were in poverty, or if they weren't in poverty, they were struggling in very low-wage economies, and the farmers were struggling. That's why you had the rise of the populist movement, which we talked about in a previous show, to challenge the robber barons of great wealth and try to develop government policies that were actually in the interests of struggling farmers and workers. And in those days, if you were an ordinary American, you weren't cushioned by Social Security, right? You didn't have something to fall back on in your old age. You didn't have Medicaid, so if you couldn't afford medical care, you could get it. You didn't have Medicare to care for you in your age. You didn't have food stamps if you were struggling to feed your family. Yeah, government could get along in those days just on tariffs because government wasn't doing anything good for the American people. It was scarcely doing anything at all. And that's not all. This was the era of Jim Crow discrimination. You know what that was all about, Sam?
Separating blacks from whites?
Yes, it was segregation in the South, where most black people lived, but it went way beyond segregation. Blacks were relegated to the lowest paying menial jobs. They were segregated not just in schools, but in hospitals and public facilities like courthouses, amusement parks, restaurants. They were being lynched in large numbers. They had no presence in law enforcement. It was just a horrible era to be a black person in America. And it wasn't a very good era to be a woman either. Could women vote in the 1880s?
No.
No. And even, by the early 20th century, they could vote only in a handful of very small states. And a number of states, they had no control over their own earnings. They couldn't sit on juries. They did not have equal job or educational opportunities with men. So this is that wonderful era of the robber barons that Trump wants to take us back to. But it doesn't stop there. Two of the worst depressions in American history were the Depression of the 1880s that lasted slightly more than 3 years in the middle of the 1880s, and the Depression of the 1890s that began in 1893 and did not end until 1897 and was second in severity only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And frankly, Sam, not that far behind it. Here are some statistics. The stock market plunged. 500 banks closed. 1,500 businesses failed. Thousands of farmers lost their land. The unemployment rate, it's now 4%, right? It hit 25% in Pennsylvania, 35% in New York, and 43% in Michigan, the industrial heartland of America. And this was the era of the McKinley Tariff of 1890 that Donald Trump so touts. So, the idea that we should be striving for the economy of the 1880s and 1890s is just one of the worst frauds perpetrated among so many upon the American people.
So you're saying that his history lesson yesterday in his speech was totally bogus.
And we can go on. Not only was it bogus with regard to the Gilded Age, it was bogus regard to the early 20th century. He has correctly stated that in 1913, the Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, cut tariffs. And he claimed that led to the Great Depression, right?
Right.
Well, who came into power in the presidential election of 1920, 9 years before the Great Depression? Was it the Democrats?
I'm assuming no.
No, it was the Republicans who held power throughout the 1920s, won every presidential election by a landslide, controlled both houses of Congress, and guess what they did with tariffs leading up to the Great Depression?
Push them forward.
Push them up. And then, of course, there is the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which economists, whether liberal, conservative, libertarian, independent, whatever, are pretty uniformly in agreement. And, my famous saying by my good buddy, the late, great Jack German, there's an economist on every corner in D.C., and not one of them agrees with another one. Well, the one thing they agree on is the awful effects on deepening and prolonging the Great Depression of the trade war perpetrated by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And, I'm not an expert on this, but I've read some economists saying that the Trump tariff rounds are even more severe, get this, than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs.
Interesting. Yeah, I find it interesting that everybody is going around on media saying, why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? He said it point blank in his speech yesterday. He wants to build wealth, which is going to go to the richest people in the country, which include him and all his friends. And he wants to go back to the 1890s. He wants to go back to the robber baron era where the rich controlled the country. It seems very clear to me.
Yeah. And you didn't even need to listen to his speech. He's been saying this kind of thing ever since he got into politics. One of the most revealing things that Trump said was during his first term when his rich friends flocked to Mar-a-Lago. Can ordinary people afford Mar-a-Lago?
Afford what at Mar-a-Lago?
Like becoming members or even golfing there?
I don't think
eating
so.
there?
I
Of course
don't think
not.
so, no.
And he said, I am going to make you even richer. This is the thing about Trump, and it's the thing I don't understand. He's been out front about everything. He hasn't disguised what he thinks. He hasn't disguised what he wants to do. It's the spineless Democrats who, say, oh, he's only joking. You can't take that seriously. Maybe he's just being sarcastic. I think anyone who believed that, who still believes that, what have I got to sell them, Sam?
I don't want to hear it.
I don't want to hear about my big bridge in Brooklyn, huh?
This chart that he brought out yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
which had these insanely high numbers for the tariffs that other countries are charging us. It had some sort of asterisk below it, and it said it included currency manipulation and other trade barriers. But there were some countries like Vietnam that had numbers as high as 90%. Has that chart been totally proven to be misleading, or what's the deal with that chart?
Can you imagine Trump being misleading about facts? Come on, Sam.
Oh, my gosh.
Where have you been? The chart was totally bogus and has been completely debunked. It has nothing to do with tariffs. I repeat.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Really? Nothing?
Nothing.
Okay.
Those numbers are not tariffs. They're not other trade barriers. according to the articles I've read by economists, this isn't me, this is, independent economists, the way he came up with these numbers was not to look at tariff rates, but to take the trade deficit with another country and divide that by the total volume of imports to the U.S. So if a country had imported, say, $100 billion worth of imports to the U.S., and our trade deficit was $50 billion, then what would go on his chart is 50%. But that's not a 50% tariff. As I said, nothing to do with tariffs. That's to do with the volume of trade and the differentials in trade, which are due to all kinds of things. The fact that, we run a trade deficit is not necessarily a negative thing. Why do we buy things from abroad, Sam?
Because they're cheap.
Because they're cheap, and we're the richest country in the world. So it's not surprising. We would buy more from Vietnam than we would sell to Vietnam, right?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know what kind of wages they pay, but they're a fraction of what we pay here.
That's not right either, is it?
I'm not saying that's right,
okay,
but that's why you have these trade imbalances. So those numbers have nothing to do with tariffs and cannot be used to justify tariffs. Moreover, Trump has imposed tariffs on at least one country where we have a positive trade balance.
Australia?
And, the Australians I read about are scratching their heads. We don't have a high tariff, but he's hitting us with a 10% tariff, even though the United States has a positive trade balance with Australia.
I think part of the issue is, we're talking about all this really deep economic stuff and that we're the richest country in the world. But I think the reason why Trump resonates with so many Americans and why he's president again is because I don't know if a lot of Americans are feeling that richness right now, or even before Trump, or in the last, 10, 20 years.
I think there's some truth to that. But what I think Americans are waking up to is that for all his so-called populist rhetoric, is Trump really a populist?
Hell no.
No, he's not benefiting ordinary Americans. He's very explicit, as we've said, about going back to the robber baron era and making his rich friends even richer. And people are catching on.
It's too late. I mean,
it's too late. We warned them. We warned them. How many times did we warn them that this is exactly what Trump is going to do? You can't believe the fact that he's out for ordinary people, because that's the opposite of what Trump stands for. And now people are feeling much greater pain than they did under Biden, and it's registering in the polls, the latest poll. And this is usually a honeymoon period for new presidents. I think it was I forget which poll it was, but it was one of the few starred polls by the New York Times indicating the highest quality poll, and it had Trump 10% underwater. And virtually every poll has Trump on the economy somewhere in the 30% range. And this is during the supposed honeymoon period. And people are feeling the pain already, Yes, the stock market does tend to reflect more of the upper classes, but in this day and age, ordinary people, elderly people like me, depend on it for our retirement, and young people like you depend upon it for a bright future for the country.
On this infamous chart as well, there were numbers about, our quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs, although I heard Kramer today on CNBC saying that they're not actually reciprocal. But you see numbers like in China, the reciprocal tariff at 34%. But we've learned in the last 24 hours that actually China may be paying up to 50% because the reciprocal tariff is on top of already existing
That's
tariffs.
correct. 54%.
Automobile tariffs and the baseline 10% tariff that he put on every country in the world. So some of these tariffs are like astronomically high. I mean, a 54% tariff with China, can we even trade with China anymore?
Well, you can if you want to double the price for your TV or your phone.
Right. And so what? Are we just going to wait until these all these tech factories are in the U.S. How long is it? I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to wrap my head around even what's going to happen. Not even if it's going to be good or bad, but like, is America going to start building all of these factories that build these flat screen TVs now, and eventually what's going to happen? I don't even understand.
Economists have analyzed that, Sam. Again, we're not economists, but some very good economists have analyzed that. One, manufacturing plants don't move easily. It's not the kind of thing,
right?
Like, you're moving from New York to Boston and you could do it in a week. It takes years to move factories. The economists estimate there would be no significant movement for at least a decade. It would take at least a decade for any, assuming it happens. That's how long it would take. Two, there's a good reason it's not going to happen, and we just talked about that. We're too high wage for a lot of these manufacturing operations. Remember when Trump, I think, was selling clothing or something like that? Where was he getting his material from? The U.S.?
No, I don't.
No,
think so.
He was getting it, of course, from these low-wage foreign countries. So if you're a manufacturer and you can pay, I'm just throwing this out. I'm not saying it's accurate. $10 an hour in Vietnam, and you got to pay $30 an hour in the U.S., tariffs alone are not going to offset that.
Now, because he's doing this all through executive order, let's say a Democrat or even a Republican who's not on the same page with Trump economically, can they just come in 4 years, change all these tariffs
Absolutely.
back? And then anything that he would have done, if it's going to take 10 years to see the benefit from, then we're just going to see 4 years of
pain. But,
should they just keep the tariffs on then at that point?
He doesn't have to. Who knows what Trump...
No, I'm saying the next president.
The next president, you don't want to keep these tariffs on. As I said, the notion of large-scale manufacturing moving to the U.S. from these low-wage countries is pretty much of an illusion. That's why I said 10 years if it were to happen. In other words, if they really wanted to move, it would still take a very long time. Did we get a $100 donation?
Yes.
Wow, thank you so much. That's really important to us.
Zero. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
So I want to pose to you the question that's in our title. Did Trump just ruin the U.S. economy?
Seems to. I mean, again, I'm not an economist, but, I understand history. And tariffs have ruined the U.S. economy before. And that was in an era when we were much less dependent upon the global economy, much less dependent on trade. In 1890, when you had the McKinley tariff, our trade accounted for about 4.5% of our economy. Today, it's 14.5%, more than 3 times higher. So anything you do, and it's even much higher than when the Smoot-Hawley tariff was put into effect. So anything you do with the global economy, because we're so enmeshed in it, has much more of a reverberating effect today than in these prior periods of U.S. history.
Do you think Trump just isn't that smart when it comes to economics?
No, I think we nailed it. He wants to go back to the era of the robber barons. He doesn't care what happens to ordinary Americans. He thinks he can keep them in line with his culture war. And by blaming Biden, Obama, Grover Cleveland, FDR, you name it, for everything.
Immigrants.
Yes, through immigrants and the culture war. We talked about this before. This is his way of distracting us from what he's really doing and what the real problem is, this enormous disparity of wealth and income in America. Remember, we showed you the statistics. From 1989 to the present, 13.5, not billion, but trillion dollars have been transferred from 99% of us to 1% of us. That's many thousands of dollars for every household in America.
So again, I know you're not an economist, but you are savvy to policy and economic policy. Off the top of your head, what are some policies that you would be for that could fix problems like the problems on Main Street, the lack of jobs, the affordability
Well, we
crisis.
don't have a lack of jobs. That's a myth.
Well, okay, maybe not the lack of jobs, but the real wage gap between...
Yes. All right. I'm not going to go through a whole set of policy prescriptions, but I'll just name a couple. Number one and most important is the taxing of wealth. What did Donald Trump pay when we revealed his taxes? $250 in taxes. The woman who cleans his toilets probably pays more in taxes than Donald Trump does. I don't know what Elon Musk pays, but probably little or nothing. Even Warren Buffett, who's a liberal, admitted, I pay fewer taxes than my secretary. And we need to go after the wealth that's hiding in these offshore, overseas, closed economy. We're talking about trillions upon trillions of dollars that we are just letting go and letting the very rich scoop them up. And of course, we need more access to medical care, more medical research. We need to make sure Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid stay solvent. And we need to make education much more affordable in this country because the old smokestack industries are not coming back.
Right. That's what I always keep thinking is like Trump is trying to turn back the clock. The best way to jumpstart the American economy is to move forward, put a great investment on green energies, things like Bernie and AOC are promoting. Make America the solar capital of the world. I mean, that would make us rich.
It's a crime that we're not. And we just need to make education far more affordable than it is today and really invest very heavily in, unfortunately, poorer minority communities where they really need, improvement in their educational opportunities. So those are just a few things that would truly make America great, not all this myth-making that Trump is talking about. Before we get to question... Go ahead.
Wait, hold on. Cindy Cooper just gifted 10 memberships. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. That really helps. I want to talk for one moment. Can you hold this for a second?
Yes.
Want to call up something that I think I can find on my phone. And it has to do with this immigrant from our state of Maryland, Sam. His name is Abrigo Garcia. He's 29 years old. He's in the U.S. legally. He has a legal work permit. He's working as a sheet metal apprentice, pursuing his journeyman license. You know what happened to him?
Yeah, he was deported. Thank you, Dan Goldberg, for $50 donation.
The story's even worse.
Really?
Yeah. According to NBC News, ICE have pulled him over in an IKEA parking lot on March 12th, arrested him with his 5-year-old son in the car. And what grounds do they have to arrest him? What crime had he committed?
Tattoos?
None. He didn't even have the tattoos as far as we can say.
Oh.
And where did they send him?
To Sacote, the El Salvadorian prison.
To the hellhole in El Salvador, someone who had done nothing wrong. And they were called out on this, and they said, well, it was an administrative error. And if it was an administrative error, what should they do?
Fix it.
Send him back. And have they?
No.
This is March 12th. You know, what is it today? Early April, 3 weeks ago? This guy, for all we know, has died in that horrible hellhole of a prison. Now they're claiming, without a shred of proof, that he has ties to the MS-13 gang. You know, that's kind of their universal excuse. Anyone who, you know, whose rights they violate, oh, he's a gang member. No proof that any of these people are gang members, but they just say it's like voter fraud. They, you know, say, oh, we have to restrict the vote in all these ways because of voter fraud, even though they don't have a shred of proof about voter fraud. It's just like a mantra, you know, magic words. Well, gang affiliations is magic words. My heart goes out in our state to Mr. Garcia's young son, who is suffering terribly, to his wife, who is suffering terribly only because of this cruel, heartless administration that cares nothing about the fate of ordinary people.
Right. I also think a lot of things that can be done to help your average Americans and affordability are things like, Zero just gifted 20 memberships.
Wow.
Holy hell, Zero. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are things like progressive politicians are pushing, like universal child care, pre-K,
Absolutely.
the child tax credit, paid family leave. I mean, these decisions could make the burden of affordability on Americans reduce so greatly that these tariffs, not only do they not address, they could make worse.
Exactly. If you look at the things that have been most helpful to ordinary Americans, the big policy changes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, food stamps, the Affordable Care Act, the Infrastructure Bill. And who's responsible for all of these?
Progressives.
Yes, progressive presidents and progressive Congresses.
I mean, I'm of the age where a lot of my friends are having young children, and it's just like the child care costs are just
so critical.
Astronomical. I mean, even some sort of federal law about paid family leave, I feel like could improve the lives of millions of Americans across the country.
Right. Instead of making the rich richer, why not do things that are really going to make this country great again for the vast majority of its people?
Right. All right. I mean, it's a historic week, to say the least. I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Seems like. And another big issue that a lot of people are fearful of is that the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress are going to use the revenue from the tariffs, which your average American will pay. They will use that revenue then to put through this new tax bill that they'll give massive tax breaks to the rich. Again, robber baron era all over again. I mean,
we've talked about that before.
That's one of the.
That's what he wants.
Yeah, that's one of the scariest things to me is, we'll all be paying at Target and Walmart. We'll all be paying these tariffs that will go to the government, and the government's just going to give them back to rich people. It's just crazy to think about.
As I said, $13 trillion has transferred since 1989 to the top 1%. We now have a maldistribution of income and wealth that's comparable to that on the eve of the Great Depression.
And it could get worse.
And Trump wants to make it much worse. And, basically turn us into a third world type of country, which typically has these oligarchs on top and everybody else struggling.
Yeah, Robert Reich, who is an economist, has a really good video, a really simple, visually engaging video explaining how the Trump administration is going to do that. So I'd recommend checking that out. It's scary.
And it gets worse. There are other things that are going to impact ordinary people. Dismantling the Consumer Financial Protection Board.
Nancy Levin just gifted 10 memberships.
Wow. That means if you get ripped off by a bank, by, one of these payroll outfits, by a credit card company, you're going to have no recourse. That's going to hit you in the pocketbook.
Like
all
you
these
said,
health cutbacks. If you get sick, and you're much more likely to get sick. What's happening with measles, Sam?
Bad stuff.
It's now, I think, in 5 or 6 states. We haven't seen this kind of epidemic since the advent of vaccines. And, we not only have an anti-vaxxer heading up our health in America, but he's, purveying quack science remedies that are only making the situation worse for these poor kids who are getting measles. So it's not just, the direct impact on the pocketbook. It's all kinds of impacts on people's lives and on their pocketbooks as well that, you may not immediately think about.
All right, you ready to get to some questions?
I'm always ready.
Okay, we have 2,100 people watching, but we only have 700 likes, so please like the stream. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Click on the notification bell so you know we're live. We take donations and members' questions, so if you want your question in line for Allan Lichtman. You got to donate or you got to be a member. Our first question, Dad, is a $100 donation from Zero. And
Wow.
Zero has also gifted memberships. They've also donated big in the past. So thank you, Zero. We appreciate you supporting our channel. They say, Omniscient Professor Lichtman, in the not so unlikely scenario, Trump doesn't make it to 2028. How much worse would you speculate a Vance administration would be?
Oh my God! You want me to give me a heart attack by saying we could be worse off than we are now under Trump? Oh my God, that's too much to contemplate. I don't think there's any daylight between Trump and Vance in terms of what they would do and their priorities to make the rich richer and not to care about anybody else. But there are real differences in the two personalities. Vance is a lot glibber, a lot slicker, as we saw in his debate against the not very adept Tim Walz. But he doesn't have Trump's appeal to the base. Nobody does. You know, people equally conservative as Trump just don't have the same pizzazz when it comes to that MAGA base. So in a sense, I don't think Trump is just replaceable by a J.D. Vance.
I've also seen articles saying that his approval rating is really low. He's not a very popular politician.
No, he's not. His approval, both their approval ratings have been sinking. But even when Trump's approval rating was pretty good, Vance was still lagging in approval. He doesn't have that ability. He's very slick. He's very smart. He's got some kind of highfalutin Ivy League education. But he doesn't have that ability to connect with the base that Trump has. Part of establishing a movement is you have to have a figure to lead it. Ronald Reagan was singularly important for the conservative movement. He did something Barry Goldwater, equally conservative, could not do because he did not have the appeal to the base of Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, was even better than Trump in going beyond the base. But Trump is this singular figure who excites and animates the base. And I haven't seen anyone else, including Vance, on the right who could step in and replace Trump.
$60 donation from Vincent Thomas. Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas. They say, Professor, we need you now more than ever during these difficult and challenging times. But I feel like Trump's reckless actions might spark a global depression. What do you think?
I think that's very possible. Again, I'm not an economist, and I'm not in the business of predicting the economy, but lots of good economists are worried about that. And remember, when there's a recession or a depression, who benefits?
The rich.
The rich, because they can get cheap labor, they can buy up cheap assets. When people are suffering, they're less likely to challenge what the rich people are doing. And if you look at the last recession, which was under what president, Sam?
W.
No, Donald Trump. The recession of 2020.
Oh, yeah.
And when you look at the changes in income, the rich got richer and everyone else got poorer.
CD asks, but aren't the Carnegies and Rockefellers at least synonymous with philanthropy now?
Yes. They did devote a lot of their wealth to philanthropy.
Over 100 years later, they're thought of like that.
Right. But,
even during the time?
During the time, most of their wealth stayed within the families. But Carnegie in particular was very generous about donating as well. But that's kind of irrelevant. That does not change the fundamental structure of the economy, as beneficial as it is. I admire that, but that doesn't, affect our basic point.
And, the thing is, people talk about rich people doing philanthropy, and that's great. But rich people can I even touch the amount of social work that a government can do? For example, providing Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, they were talking about billions of dollars. I mean, no rich person could ever...
Talking about trillions of dollars.
Right. No rich person, even a group of rich people, could reach that sort of humanitarian...
Nor are they trying to substitute for Medicaid.
Right. So this idea
Medicare.
that you can just replace government programs with rich people is just nonsense.
It's nonsense, even though, rich people have done some good things with their money.
Sure.
But that doesn't change the structural implications of a top-heavy economy.
Limited Light says, are the tariffs a way to pay for another billionaire tax cut? We just talked about
Absolutely.
that. What do you think the chances of that happening are?
I think they're very high.
I mean, I heard Besant yesterday talking about the fact that now we need to get this tax bill done. We need to push it through quick. We need to get it done quickly.
Yep.
I feel like it's coming, folks.
It's coming. Now, here's the thing, too. If you look back, at the period of the 1880s and 1890s, and then what did Trump criticize that happened in, I think he said 1913?
I don't remember.
The income tax.
Oh, right.
Right. That was the root of all evil, was the income tax. We should have relied just on tariffs. Of course, the government wasn't doing anything in the 1880s and
during
1890s, except delivering the mail, basically.
I'm going to say, you told me yesterday the main job in the federal government outside of, serving as a member of Congress or president was being a postmaster.
Oh, and the number of postmasters far outweighed all other federaal employees, even if you count members of the Senate and the House. Overwhelmingly, federal jobs were posted. Remember, we didn't in those days have workman's compensation, unemployment compensation, Social Security, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, you name it. None of that existed.
Right. So it's like, there wasn't income tax before, but the federal government wasn't doing anything.
Exactly.
It's easy for them to not have income tax when they're not doing much.
Right. Yeah. This comparison that somehow we can replicate, the non-income tax era of the 1890s is just another, pile of historical nonsense.
Jeff V says, why does no one recognize that Trump is using tariffs as Putin uses missiles to gain greater control and power? There will be no successful negotiations.
I think there's a lot of truth to what that was. That a member question?
I don't know.
Yeah, to what our audience member just said. If you want to understand Trump, got to do what my good friend Bob Woodward did in Watergate, right? Follow the money and also follow the power. Anything else that he says or claims is totally irrelevant.
Member Nan B says, will our country fall into a deep recession soon after the tariffs kick in? How do you think Trump will handle this recession? Possible recession.
Again, I'm not an economist, and even the economists are terrible at predicting the economy. So I'm not going to say we're going to fall into a deep recession, although I think it is now far more likely than it was under Joe Biden that is going to happen. And I think Trump is going to handle the recession the same way he did the last time. Basically let the recession rage and not really deploy the power of government to deal with the recession, particularly as it affects ordinary Americans, and the fact that he's hollowed out the government makes it way more difficult to deal with the kinds of problems like unemployment, health issues, hunger, housing that arise under a depression. He has dismantled employees and programs that deal with these problems.
Thank you, Philip H., for donating 5 subs. We appreciate it. I saw someone say in the chat.
How much did they donate?
5 memberships.
Oh, I thought you said 5 cents.
Oh no, I guess I don't know if you can.
We'll take anything, but 5 members is much better than 5 cents.
Yeah. I heard someone say in the chat he's going to deal with the recession by golfing.
Pretty much. So he deals with everything, and these employees, making not minimum wage, but barely enough to sustain their families, Oh, my God, we got to get rid of them to have economy and government. But how much are we spending on Trump's golf trips? The last I saw was over $10 million. Yep. That would pay for a lot of probationary employees, wouldn't it, Sam?
A lot.
A lot.
Artem Abramovs donated 4,000 Hungarian forint, or forint, F-O-R-I-N-T.
Okay.
Hungarian forint. You know how much that is in U.S.?
Probably about $10.
How'd you know that?
I know everything.
Wow. $10.98. So about 11
that's close enough.
Yeah.
Come on.
But hey, that's still good. Thank you, Artem.
Yes, we'll take it.
They say even the right-leaning poly markets give a 53% chance of recession. Also, tariffs were imposed on the uninhabited Heard and McDonald's Islands.
I saw that.
Yeah.
These are islands off Antarctica that I think are occupied by penguins.
Right.
This just shows, the gross negligence and incompetence. You should be if you're doing something that is so monumental for the American and global economy, you better get it all right. And, I wouldn't dispute the fact that, there's about an even chance, maybe slightly above, that we're going to hit a recession. But again, I'm not predicting that. Maybe I will at a future show, but I'm not ready to do a prediction yet.
Okay. Stay tuned, folks. He's got to crunch the numbers. Remember, Future Shock says, do you believe Trump will be removed from office before the economy goes into a recession? And are we all doomed for the breadline?
I'm not sure it'd be that bad. Even in the Great Depression, not everyone was on the breadline, although there were quite a few. I was talking about the Great Depression of the 1890s, kind of the forgotten depression, which was almost as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the 1930s, you had all these shanty towns developed for people who couldn't afford to live in the cities. You know what they called them, Sam?
Shanty towns?
No. Hoovervilles.
Oh, Hoovervilles.
Hoovervilles. Well, in the 1890s, they had these soup kitchens because people couldn't feed themselves. And the president at the time was Grover Cleveland, and they called them Cleveland cafes. But we have a lot more cushion than we did, in the 1930s or really the late 20s or the 1890s due to all of these kinds of programs that I've been talking about that, are unfortunately also now in jeopardy under the Trump administration. So I don't think we're going to go back to Cleveland kitchens, but I do think ordinary Americans could be in for a lot of hardship, sadly. I hope it doesn't happen.
I hope it doesn't happen, too. What do you think about the union, specifically UAW, supporting these Trump tariffs? Seems like anyone who might benefit from the protectionist policies will entirely be offset by the negative consequences.
I couldn't agree more.
Actually, can I answer this question?
Yeah,
because I saw an interview with Sean Fain, the head of the UAW, and while he did say he did support the tariffs, he said very clearly that they're a tool that needs to be used wisely and specifically, which Trump didn't do. He also said that they are one part of the equation and many other things need to be done along with the tariffs to support workers. So I've seen a lot of media outlets being like, all the unions support the tariffs. Yeah. It's not that black and white.
That's a very good answer. And unions have typically been a bit protectionist because they don't like competing with low-wage foreign economies, but also the automakers, upon whose work the unions depend, also get parts from abroad that are going to become more expensive with these tariffs.
Remember, Alex Kawa says, on the topic of trade, understanding that tariffs are ineffective and only jack up prices, what are other ways to protect American jobs from being outsourced?
Absolutely. As we said, the history of tariffs is a sordid one, and particularly in this economy, when we're so dependent upon the global economy. These kind of meat axe tariffs, as Sam said, these are not, tariffs done with a scalpel. These are tariffs done with an axe, are exactly the wrong thing. And, I really have yet to see, and I can't say I've surveyed everything, but I've looked at it a lot, any independent economists, who are not tied to the Trump administration, endorsing what he's done.
But I don't think you answered the question. What are some ways to protect jobs, American jobs, from being outsourced?
Well, American jobs are not being outsourced. We had under the Biden, that's just another myth. We had record job creation. We have unemployment now at about 4%, historically low. Outsourcing of jobs is not a big problem for the American economy. It pales in comparison to the biggest problem, which we have, pounded on, and that is the enormous disparity of income and wealth. And if you want to protect American jobs and help ordinary Americans, you got to begin to reduce that gap. You got to begin to tax wealth. And the way in which you preserve good jobs here, we've talked about a lot of things, but, being an educator, I am, of course, focused on education, because the future of employment in America is not in the old smokestack industries. It is in educated jobs.
80 Mart says, just to push back a little, these tariffs may reduce foreign tariffs on the U.S., which can help reduce prices in the long run. What are your thoughts?
I don't think that tariffs on the U.S. Is what increases prices. It's tariffs on the cheaper foreign goods. American goods that we trade abroad are already high priced. So I don't think, although it's probably a good thing, reducing tariffs abroad for the American economy is going to do much for prices. Plus, again, when I've looked at what independent economists have said, they said the likelihood is not that other nations will reduce tariffs, but what will happen is like what happened after Smoot-Hawley. Other nations will raise tariffs as part of a trade war with the U.S.
A lot of people have realized that tomorrow is our birthday. They're saying happy birthday.
Well, we appreciate that.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I'm not going to tell you my age, but Sam is still very young.
I'm not going to tell you my age either. 80 Mart adds, I'm not sure if this is true, but they say Biden kept the Trump tariffs from the first term and even added more. I don't know about that.
I know he did keep the tariffs, but they were way lower than anything that's being contemplated here. No one's talking about a zero tariff economy. I'm not sure we've ever had that, but we are talking about not massively, by meat axe, indiscriminately raising tariffs.
Uh-oh, someone figured out that your age is on Wikipedia.
Oh, no. I mean, Wikipedia says I'm 48?
Yep. Here is a Discord question from Emma. If you want to join our Discord, the link to that is in the description of this video in our Linktree link. They say, I'm a longtime listener of the show and tune in weekly. Last week, during the Signalgate segment, Allan mentioned that the situation was worse because of open source encryption. I just wanted to push back on that point. I totally agree that they should clearly all resign. However, open source encryption isn't the risk. Open source encryption is more secure because it assumes attackers can see everything. It doesn't hide how it works. It proves that even if you know every detail, you still can't break it. That's real security. Closed systems, by contrast, rely on attackers not knowing something, which fails the moment someone does. Open source tech and governments is actually better because it's open to the public scrutiny and vulnerabilities. With Signalgate, none of them should be let off the hook by blaming the tech. It's their behaviors that were wrong.
I completely agree. It's the behaviors that were wrong. And if you listen to me over months and years and decades even, there is no bigger advocate of government transparency. But we're not talking here about something that should be transparent, right, Sam?
Right.
Talking about the weapons and the timing of an attack on foreign soil. And if that had gotten out, it could have cost American lives and really undermined the mission, as misguided as I think the mission was anyway. So that was my criticism of it. Certainly should have been classified, but that's not the issue. The Espionage Act deals with national security information, not specifically classified. 90% of classified information isn't even national security. It should not have been on Signal, which people can break into. That was my only point.
Someone just asked, when's your next marathon?
Never. But I am going to the Senior Olympics. I'm not running the marathon. I qualified in the Maryland Olympics, and I am running the 1,500-meter run and the 800-meter run. I don't do marathons anymore.
Philip H. says, happy 48th, Dad.
I appreciate that.
Member Peggy Cox says, if and when the judge rules the Trump administration violated court orders by flying alleged gang members to El Salvador, what options will there be for the punishment of this administration? If Trump is held in criminal contempt, what will that look like for him? What consequences would he be facing?
It's an excellent question. And I'm going to quote James Madison, the architect of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And Madison said, we have done everything in our power through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to balance power, to make sure that no one branch of government can be reigning supreme over all others. So there are systems of checks and balances. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. But he went on to say, no matter how good the system, it is still dependent on the virtue of those in power. If those in power do not have virtue and are willing to override and ignore the system, then the system will fail. And that's the problem here. You have a president and an administration that lacks virtue and has made it pretty clear, that they are not necessarily going to adhere to court rulings if they go against them. They haven't explicitly said, we're not going to follow the courts. But so far, in practice, they've either slow-walked court decisions or really not complied with them all, making excuses. Oh, we can't really bring these people back from El Salvador, even if the court orders it. Absolute nonsense. Of course, they could bring people back if they really wanted to. And the problem is, holding Trump in contempt has no consequences. He doesn't care. He has no shame. He'll just say it's lunatic, radical, Trump-hating judges. And who has to prosecute if you're held in contempt?
I don't know.
Justice Department. And who runs the Justice Department?
Pam Bondi.
Pam Bondi, Trump's loyalist. So, yeah, we could be in a real constitutional crisis.
What are your thoughts on Eric Adams leaving the Democratic Party to run as an independent in the NYC mayor race?
Good riddance is
He's
what I
toast,
would say.
Right? He's gotta
who
be
wants
toast.
him?
He's toast. Arash Taheri says, Dr. Lichtman, the apprehension of students and innocent civilians reminds me of how 3,000 Chileans mysteriously disappeared under the Pinochet regime. Did I say that right?
Pinochet
regime.
Yes. Absolutely right. We got Pinochet because of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger when they exercised a coup against the regularly elected Chilean government, which enabled Pinochet to come into power, responsible for the disappearance of many thousands of Chileans. And we are seeing similar things here. It's not at that level yet, but in my 48 years, I could not believe I would ever see masked thugs without obvious identification in an unmarked vehicle seizing people off the streets, spiriting them away without the due process of law.
Yeah, no doubt. The videos of Mahmoud and I forgot the woman's name in at Tufts. Those videos are crazy to see. I mean, it literally looks like, they're just crazy. I don't want to make any
It looks like the black shirts in Italy,
Yeah. $15 donation from OB family. They say, hi, Professor. Greetings from Sydney.
Oh, I've always wanted to go to Sydney, yeah. My rolling away?
Yeah.
Like that old song, Slip Siding Away?
Can I hear your best Australian accent?
You are not going to hear it.
Come on.
Good day, mate.
Could be worse.
Could be worse.
Something like, put some shrimp on the barbie. That was pretty bad.
That was pretty bad.
Yeah. Anyways, they say, has there ever been another administration that compares to Trump in regards to cabinet members being so unqualified for their positions?
Not even close.
Are you sure? Are you sure it's not even close?
Look, Warren Harding was notorious for some horrible cabinet appointments. Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, was convicted of bribery and became the first cabinet member sent to prison. Harry Doherty, as Attorney General, was tried for various crimes and escaped with a hung jury. In one of the trials, only one juror held out. But he also made two of the most outstanding appointments in the history of the country: Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State and Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce.
All right, it is 10 p.m.
Two more. I'm getting tired.
Two more questions.
Two more questions. But this has been a great session. People have asked tremendous questions, and the donations and memberships have been very generous.
And the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this on my channel at Sam Lichtman.
Can we promote my course again?
Promote your course.
Yes, I'm giving a course. It's going to be very exciting with the renowned 92nd Street Y in New York. You don't have to go to New York. It's an online course, 4 hour-long lectures and Q&As starting April 23rd, April 30th, and then the 2 weeks in May. It's not expensive. I'm going to talk about the 4 most pivotal elections in U.S. history. Can we put up the link to that?
Savannah, if you're around, could you put up the link real quick and pin it to the chat?
Yeah, I really encourage you to, it's very cheap, sign up for the course. If you want to take my courses at American University, it costs you a lot more.
You got to take that up with the university.
Any university is going to charge way more.
Well, not as much as American.
American's right in line with every other private institution.
Okay. What is your favorite American history book, and who is your favorite historian? It can't be you or a book you've written.
I like John Meacham. Soul of America, I think, is an excellent. Also, Ibram Kendi, who I got to know when he was at AU, stamped from the beginning, kind of a history of slavery and black people in America.
Given Biden's decline revealed in books about the 24 election, do you feel bad about defending Biden this summer?
I don't feel a bit bad about defending Biden. I'm not a doctor, but I saw after that debate, Biden conducted his presidency in an exemplary fashion, made some very good talks to the American people, went on arduous, successful trips. So, no, I don't regret it. And who knows, if, people had listened to me, maybe the Democrats would have won.
All right, with that, we will begin to wrap up Lichtman Live. The good news is the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. You should be taken there automatically after the stream ends, but I'm going to put the link in the description just in case, or not in the description, in the chat, just in case.
Hey, who's that good-looking guy?
They can't see that.
I don't know.
The thumbnail, I guess, is what he's talking about. Let me just post this real quick, Dad, and then pin it.
Was she able to post my course?
Yep, she posted it.
Excellent.
I want to give a shout out to some people who donated who didn't get their questions up tonight. Let's see here.
Yeah, we went through a lot of questions. We even went overtime.
Hero75, Sharon Novak, Jeff V, Sean Breen, No Name, Natalie, George, Jan Goodwin, Pin Hansen, Mel Dingus, Robert Ratz, and Michael Cooper. All right, Dad, what are your final words to the people tonight?
Keep the faith. That's all I can tell you. I don't want to just be a purveyor of grim news. There was some very good news this week, right? In Wisconsin, Sam?
Right.
I called it. At what point did I call
6%.
6% in, I called the Democrat. Well, it's not officially a Democrat, but the Democrat-backed Supreme Court justice would win. This was a pivotal election because it gave the Democrats, or I say the liberals, control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. That's going to deal with voter ID, civil rights, redistricting, labor rights, abortion rights. Could not be more important. and the progressive won by 10 points in a swing state. So all is not lost. You know, as I've said, vote, organize, support groups that are challenging the threats to our democracy.
All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the night. The Lichtman Live post show comes up in a few minutes. Hang in there, folks. See you soon.
See you